I'll just start with where I came into it, which was almost accidental. I had reconstructed a missing portion of a grand symphony almost written, by Donizetti near the end of his life, when he came to Vienna and he wanted to meet the Viennese musical public on its own terms. So he prepared a big, full-scale four-movement symphony in the style of Schubert or Mendelssohn, which is something that we don't have from any other Italian composer. And unfortunately, he got busy with other projects and he didn't live much longer. And the long and the short of it is, no last movement. And so I reconstructed the last movement from a string quartet that he was using as his basis. And Nizam Ketane heard this performance and thought it was a pretty convincing ending to the symphony, and almost immediately called me up and asked if I would dare to try Beethoven, which is, the expectations are a little different. The attention of the world on Fidelio and Beethoven is a little greater than the attention on an unknown symphony by Donizetti. But never mind, I said I was smart enough not to say yes. Instead, I said, let me look. And if I can come up with some ideas from the sketches, I will try. And so I thought here's what happened. If maybe you have read this much of the story, but I can say it very quickly. When Beethoven had to shorten the opera between 1805 and 1806, one of the things he shortened was this scene, but because he was still using some of it, and they were in a hurry, and the photocopier was a century and a half in the future, they physically tore up the scores. So anything that he was taking out to shorten this aria was gone, and we still don't have it. Maybe one day it will be discovered in a private collection in Japan, but as far as we know, people have been looking for this aria for more than 100 years. No one has found a trace of it. So that's why there's a gap, because the aria was, it's basically in two parts, a slow movement and a fast movement. Well, the slow movement was replaced by a shorter version of itself. We don't know exactly what relation the 1805 had, because that's lost. And then the fast movement was cut in half. You only have the end of it. And so what I needed to do was take the sketchbooks of Beethoven and come up with my best guess at how he might have filled it out from the sketch to make a complete aria. And so the first thing I needed to find out is, did he really sketch it all the way through? Can you, from the many different sketches and drafts and false starts and attempts to put two different ideas together, is there a complete through line? And there almost is. So that was a great relief at the beginning. The amount of this that I had to make up completely without support from Beethoven is only maybe a matter of 15 seconds. So that was great. The problem is, of course, that Beethoven didn't really make rough drafts of his music. He just made a sketch of the top line, and he trusted his memory for the rest. But sometimes the rest is the part that makes it sound like Beethoven. So I'm going to share a screen with you for just a moment to show you the kind of thing I found myself looking at. Let's see. Okay, this should work. First, you're going to see a zoom icon, but then I will change it over to what I want you to see, which is... Okay, you should now see some handwritten music. Is that right? Great. Okay, now I'm going to move it to where I can see it beside the faces. Chicken scratch. And look, if you read music, I'm going to just start right at the beginning of this page and play you a little bit of what's there. Of course, I couldn't read it this fast. You have to. Many scholars have gone before me in deciphering the chicken scratches, and thank God, because if I had had to start from zero, we would be ready to give Leonore next year instead of having done it already. But still, I had to retrace their steps and make sure I agree, because sometimes, if you look at these things, where my cursor is here, what notes are those? Was he aiming for a line or a space? You know, very often you have to make an educated guess. But anyway, here's what is there from the top of the page. Already there's some uncertainty about the rhythm. I just played it the way I decided to guess it. And then... well, that's not much to go on. I mean, that's a top line, but there's a lot left. However, I had right with this, it turns up in several different drafts because he went through the aria about, you know, I don't know, maybe 17 times, a little bit here, a little bit there, on different pages of his sketchbook. But when I first saw this bit and this, I had a real aha moment because it immediately reminded me of the magic flute of Mozart. In the aria of the tenor in Mozart, Tamino, so that broken run up the scale and then those sighing figures coming down the scale. And so my first thought was this: he is not making Florestan sad in this moment in the dungeon. He takes out the portrait of Leonore, and instead of lamenting, he relives the excitement of their first love. The aria in the Magic Flute is the tenor looking at a portrait, just as Florestan is doing, and feeling this surge of love for this unknown woman whose portrait he has just seen. And so here we have a very poignant variant of that, because Florestan is looking at a portrait of a beloved woman that he is sure he will never see again. But once I thought my way through why would Beethoven go to this kind of idea, I felt like I had a starting point. I felt like, okay, that gives a mood, and now I know where to go with the rest of it. So that means you have to start writing harmonies, orchestration, etc. And once again, if you go back to the top of that page, you could do this. I mean, anybody who took harmony in college can do that. But, you know, it's not necessarily so interesting. So you start drawing on all the different associations you can find. Elsewhere in Fidelio Leonore, elsewhere in Beethoven, sometimes your own imagination, but your own imagination is involved mostly in sifting through things in your head and deciding what to model. And then, of course, none of the models fit exactly. You've got to tweak them and make them fit with each other in the context of this melody, in this key, in this time signature, with these instruments, etc. And what happened here, I'll just illustrate this one more thing, and then we can go back to general discussion. But instead of this, or which would be the kind of the textbook way, at the beginning of the slow aria, the melody is a little similar. And if you remember, both in this version and in the final Fidelio, I'll play it in this key for the moment just to make it comparable. And then, okay, this harmony is not necessarily the textbook one, but it works great. So I felt like I had a starting point there, and then it's, you can say off and running. What that means is making that kind of choice again and again, bar by bar, for the entire length of the aria, and then fitting it to the instruments and to the words, and then you just hope that it doesn't sound, when your music comes in the middle of all this Beethoven, you hope it doesn't make the audience suddenly sit up and go, "Oh my God, what happened to Beethoven there?" So I think we. Go ahead.
I have two observations. One, maybe to clarify for our audience that the two sections after the introduction, which we have of Beethoven's, both instrumental and then the spoken recitative of the sung recitative of Florestan, then begins this part which Will was just playing, and you might speak to the clues in the overture to that first section, as you found the clues to this in the sketches to the second section, and where is the reference to a flute, and which might then bring in Charlie here too. How did you those two?
Well, okay, we know that melody that I already played to you, the one that sounds like Mozart, we know that that's for flute. It's in a range that could only be flute. And in one of the sketches, not quite the same one that we used for the final version, because I tried to sort of figure out what is likeliest to have been the latest sketch. That proves nothing, because he might have gone back to an earlier one. But at least you know it's the fruit of working over it. And so in one of the earlier sketches, it does say FL for flöte, for flute. So that was certain enough. And we know for sure that there was still a flute in the scene in 1805. Why? Because one of the pages that didn't get thrown out. Why not? Because he needed something that was on the back of it. They needed something on the back of this page. It shows a flute listed among the instruments of the aria. But in the 1806 version, no more flute, and no more line for the flute either. So far we knew that it has to be a flute there. And I think what's obvious is that the flute comes in when he takes out the portrait of his wife. So I imagined it as being a kind of ray of sunlight in the gloom of the dungeon. And I thought of the flute as sort of being her in his mind, being the imaginary image of her, the oral image to go with the physical image in the portrait. And to get back to your question, Ryan, about the overture, the slow aria, we know that it wasn't what is in 1806. We also know that it had themes in common with the one that is in 1806. And we also have a little quotation from it in the overture to the opera, the 1805 overture, the one that Ryan played. So by taking the instrumentation from that quote in the overture, we have a few bars at the beginning that we can say, this is pure Beethoven. And then I just sort of continue from that as best I could, what would logically come from that. The one thing I had to make up is how do you get the flute in? Because in the sketches, the slow aria ends with basically this, or one version is this. It's the one I picked. Then you have the flute melody. Well, only one sketch shows anything in between, and what it shows is this. Plus a number, 6, which means this. So, in other words, it was just a jotting down the harmony. Yeah, no, she go on. But it does mean, okay, I should use this C6-5 chord. 6-4-3 chord. And so what I decided to do is bring in the flute on the note it has in common with the harmony. something like that. And then that leads up to the melody. And so that was the longest moment of my invention, and even that is kind of copied from something in the 1814 Fidelio.
There are not that many extended solos where the flute actually introduces the material. I thought about that. There's a beautiful number from the Prometheus ballet music for harp, and there, the odd things in the symphonies and of course concertos. But it's interesting what Will said, that if the flute represents her love, his love for, or represents her, you said, right?
Yeah, in my mind.
Yeah, right, and that makes sense. But so often in Beethoven, it always strikes me, I'm always sort of jealous that the oboe and the clarinet always gets the most touching, moments. So it's nice for the flute to have a touching moment too. It also, and maybe it's trying to making too much out of it, but also somehow the flute playing this melody it makes me think. I know that the Pastoral Symphony comes a couple years later, three years later or so. But I don't know if the flute somehow helps create in the listener's mind the connotation of springtime, which is mentioned in line 1 already. I know that the flute plays in the third stanza, right? In the third stanza, but something about the choice of the flute to play to play this melody, I don't know, it gives something of a springtime feeling, and right. It is a little bit.
Charlie, I think you're exactly right there, because in the first stanza he's saying, "All my joy was taken away in the springtime right. of my life," but then in this very verse where the flute comes in, he's going back to that springtime in his mind right. with her.
Yeah.
So I think that's your interpretation is perfect.
Well, and yeah, and no, it's just nice that it's a shame that he took it out for the subsequent versions of the opera, actually, because it's nice for the flute to have a nice solo like this, And by the way, I must admit that I didn't realize until all too recently how much Will had done in terms of orchestration and thinking about it. I knew he had done some, but now it really hit home in the last time. So this entire time that we rehearsed and played and I was really under the impression that this was a lot more Beethoven and a lot less Will Crutchfield. So anyway, that's a
great compliment to Will.
Yeah.
Does that mean I fooled you?
You fooled me.
I hope so. Thank you, because as far as the structure goes, I really was taking it straight from the sketches, even though all I had was the top line. That does determine, how long in this key, how many bars in that key, how long does it take to get to the reprise, how long does it take to get to the next section. And I would say you're exactly right. I think it's much more Mozartian. It shows the part of Beethoven that was grounded in Mozart and Haydn and not yet going off on his radical paths. So that's what I tried to follow that in the instrumentation. I have to admit, if I did that, it was by luck, because I didn't have time to study the part of the opera that comes after this. Of course, I know the Fidelio version, but I didn't have the time to study the part of Leonore that comes after this more than just sort of once or twice through. So I'm glad.
It brings up an interesting point too, though, that Beethoven will probably, like Beethoven, like any composer, is working both from conscious knowledge as well as unconscious knowledge. That there are many things of music running around in Will's brain and all of our brains that we're reminded of when we're doing something else. And I'm certain many of the connections, that motivic connections that Beethoven is making, as any composer is making, are unconscious. But that's a very interesting point about that line. I remember when Charlie first did it too. Charlie will remember that there's a chromatic alteration in that in that figure you're referring to. Anyway.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, right. So we just learned, unfortunately, that Bonn, the city of Bonn, has canceled its Beethoven Festival, which was to be a huge thing in September because of the 250th anniversary. And one of the reason I know that is because Christophe Housset, a friend and colleague of Les Talents Lyriques, was going to do a performance of the Gaveau and use our edition during those celebrations. And of course, it's all been canceled.
There were a couple of places that caught my ear that I found myself thinking about it. In the little burst of coloratura on Als mein Blick an deinem hing, words almost at the beginning of the F major section. Coloratura is terrible, but it is Beethoven. I mean, I went and checked.
Yeah,
it is Beethoven's sketch. And where that was interesting to me is I think that the coloratura in the first version of the Leonore aria is absolutely wretched too.
It is awful. It is unsingable. It is unperformable. I think this is not nearly as bad as that because this bit, that is that little chromatic bit over the sharp root and then the appoggiatura of the ninth. That's something that was kind of coming into the vocabulary, so it didn't bother me, but it is a little awkward. And look, let's face it, everyone who says Beethoven didn't know how to write for the voice is correct. He didn't. He obviously was not himself a habitual natural singer, and so you just have to, as a singer, you just have to sort of suck it up and do the hard work and make it work, because the ideas are the ideas of genius. But as far as lying easily along the paths that the vocal cords know how to travel, forget it.
You know, we didn't talk about it, but the one bit of coloratura that our audience here has heard was, of course, in Leonore's aria, and the extraordinary coloratura at the end, which is in the 1805 version, but not in the later version. What we didn't remark upon was that, you know, the bassoon follows her line. They do it in just note for note together at this very fast triplet stuff. But it's impossible. The voice has got to take a breath, and so she she picked just the right spot to drop two notes. You hear the bassoon continue with those notes, but she catches her breath so she can get to the high note. And so it's just another example of the incredible demands that Beethoven was putting, not really thinking as a singer, but that a singer today has to negotiate one way or another. So,
well, I will say, I thought she did a spectacular job of musically.
Yes.
It was one of the best performances of that I've heard. We also know that the singer, the first performance, refused to sing it because of that wretched. And I think it has a lot to do with the relationship between the music and the declamation of the words, because it's the declamation of the words that is off.
Yeah, right. And singers do change, and often there's this discussion and that I have with the singer that they say, I'd really prefer to do this on that syllable and then move that syllable a little further, and which makes it much more singable. But those are the things we deal with in a lot of music, but we did here too.
Will say this is close enough to the kind of Mozart concept of the two-part aria that I felt quite comfortable. I think if I had to try to complete a Bach fugue from only the soprano voice, I would probably turn that one down.
And we're so glad that you didn't turn this one down. And it was so exciting around Thanksgiving to just get what you had done. And we decided, we weren't sure we're going to do it. We agreed, Will and I, that we said, well, actually, I said, Will, how do we publicize this? What do we do? He said, not yet. Let's see what I can do. And so it wasn't until Thanksgiving that you produced this. And we thought, wow, this is really amazing. And that we said, we have to do it. And then went forward. And I think it's a real gift, not only to us, but to the ages and to flutists. Who get to now to have more Beethoven to work with. So I thank you very much again, and thank Charlie for engaging with it and look. And Charlie, is there anything else you'd like to add? I know you mentioned the Schumann Spring Symphony later, and then I was thinking of all those. When you think of flute, you think of outdoors, on all the, of course, with all the bird references in the 18th century.
Right.
But
that was mainly it. And yeah, no, and just that his choice of instrument at that moment of I mean, it was a very deliberate choice, and without trying to read too much into it, obviously, it means something.
Here's another. Oh, go ahead.
No, and just the idea of nature and springtime, F major, there's enough in there to.
Oh, does anyone else? I have another question to bring up when you brought up Schumann, and to me, and does anyone else have the reaction that the end of Beethoven's 1805 Florestan aria, that with it's now the text mildred Liebe, or soften your does anyone else hear Schumann in that? Because I thought it's the way the accompaniment works with a line and it's then clarinet afterwards. It sounded Will, do you hear that at all?
Yeah,
do you hear,
double suspensions. That's totally Mendelssohn Schumann. For Beethoven, that was kind of out there.
Yeah, and we talked last week about how out there how progressive in the middle of the Act 2 finale, the clarinet bassoon line leading into the do rocco is, and so we've seen this progression, as Barry was mentioning. We've seen it in the beginning of the first movements of the opera, which are more opéra comique, more 18th century referential, and to these really progressive musical moments in the end of the finale of Act 2, and here what we've begun to see. Perhaps some in the introduction. We didn't even talk about the introduction to Act 3, but it's just an example of what a fascinating journey I think this piece takes us on. And next week we'll do the trio of both Gaveau and Beethoven, and have Jean-Michel with us, and people can also, as I mentioned, feel free to ask him questions about this aria, which of Will's and of Beethoven's, which he got to sing.
Hey Ryan, can I add one other thing? It just came to me now, thanks to Charlie talking about springtime, and I wish I thought of this before, not for the music, but for the program note. But the idea of the flute as a symbol of lost joy in present sadness. Is that reminding anybody of something? Heiligenstadt Testament?
Yeah.
When Beethoven wrote those heart-rending words about what it meant to him to be losing his hearing, What is the image he told? What is this the little anecdote he told doing that? That he was in the countryside, maybe in springtime, I don't know, with a friend who said how beautiful the shepherd's pipe, and Beethoven could not hear it. So that's kind of, I mean, that's an added layer of this flute as lost joy in present sorrow.
And it continues later. Yeah, that's very interesting.